Welcome back. The title of this mini lecture is the 1960s. Let's get into it. So, the goal of this mini lecture is to talk about 5 terms that as you read more about the history of American sport and gaming, that you have kind of a frame of reference or understanding for the complex nature of kind of what's going on, in American life, in the 1960s. So, if somebody was living in the 60s, what are some of the things that they would have encountered, right? Let's get into it. So the first is counterculture. So again, the 1960s there's a lot, right? So early 60s in some ways is very different than late 60s. Counterculture usually refers to either people and communities that engaged in different forms of activity that would have been considered quote unquote counter to the norm, right? So this could be any number of things, from the clothes that someone is wearing, right? So if someone is not wearing what would be considered sort of quote unquote socially appropriate clothing, if someone is not dressed correctly, right? So I'm a professor, so why am I doing this in a t-shirt, right? That idea that would not be considered appropriate. The kind of hair cut that somebody would have had, right? All of this. Someone's openness to drug use in the 1960s, or the kind of music that they would have engaged with. Their openness on things like sexual activity, right? This kind of stuff. All would have been a part of this counterculture. The politics of it as well, would have grown in prominence throughout the 1960s. But again, we should be mindful that while you've got the counterculture on one side, right, it's counter to what? Which kind of brings us to our second term, which is conservatism, right? So conservatism as a movement was growing in popularity in the 1960s. And that is perhaps most typified by our third term, which is 1968. So Richard Nixon, the former vice president, is going to win the presidency, or win that election in 1968. Nixon was a Republican. Nixon was, in many ways, a reflection of this kind of conservative backlash against a number of aspects of the 1960s. One of the things of the 60s, of course, is the Vietnam conflict, and of course the protests that surrounded that conflict. Many Americans, by the time you get to the end of the 1960s, they're actually opposed to the Vietnam War. However, by about 1970, the majority are opposed to the Vietnam War. However, many are opposed to the tactics that protesters were using, right? So the counterculture, the support of those kinds of alternative tactics to have one's voice heard, many in the conservative movement were deeply, deeply angered by this. So conservatism, of course, has its roots in a number of different themes. Certainly the role of religion is a part of this. Part of it was a view that the government should be the arbiter of moral authority. So you're going to see a backlash against aspects of the civil rights legislation that had been enacted. So certainly race is going to be a part of this for some. There's going to be a backlash to the rights struggles for women that were going on at this time. There's going to be a backlash against the rights struggles for what we refer to today as the LGBTQ community. There's going to be a backlash against that. There were any number of rights struggles that are happening in the 1960s, and so you have some within the conservative movement that are pushing back against these. They're pushing back against the anti-war movement. There's a certain there's a lot of different views on that. But again, conservatism is kind of growing in popularity in the 1960s. So 1968 again is the third term. 1968 is important because of the many, many complex events that are happening in that year. There's the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, the sad realities of the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. Robert Kennedy is also assassinated. You have unrest in Chicago at the Democratic National Convention, but you also have global protests against the Vietnam War and expressions of global counterculture at this time. The Vietnam War itself, that would be, kind of our fourth term. So this is a significant part of the arc of the 1960s. from the Gulf of Tonkin resolution in 1964, the expansion of U.S. forces in 1965, the continual kind of draft and conflict through 1968, the Tet Offensive and the significant increase in U.S. forces in 68 and into 69, of then the drawdown by 69, or the starting of the drawdown by, with Nixon in 69. Yeah, and that kind of brings us to so Vietnam is an active part of this. The Beatles and television. So the appearance of rock music and rock performers on things like the Ed Sullivan Show, by 1964, are really going to kind of start to reshape kind of popular sort of culture for many in America. And the Beatles' appearance, in particular on the Ed Sullivan Show, was incredibly significant. All right. Thanks so much.